Welcome to another installment of Fundamentals of a Human Anatomy. Today we're looking at cranial foramina, the holes and openings within the skull. The brain is housed within the skull, and there are quite a few small openings that allow the passage of blood vessels and nerves. The brain, of course, needs information. The sensory organs throughout the body, most of them in and around the head, need to bring their data, their information back into the brain. And those nerves that connect from things like eyes and ears pass through small holes in the skull to reach the brain. Also, the brain controls muscles throughout the body, and so passes motor nerves out through various openings and holes in order to connect to those muscles that it controls. And thirdly, blood vessels, arteries need to bring oxygenated blood in through this bone to nourish the brain, and that deoxygenated blood then needs to flow out and back into circulation. So we're going to see quite a few different foramina in the skull. We'll also look at some special ones, some ones that are a little bit different. The cranial foramina are found basically on the anterior and the inferior surfaces of the skull when you're looking from externally. So the two pictures on the left here, you see a front view and an inferior view of the skull with a number of the foramina indicated. Also, these same foramina can be seen from inside the skull. The image on your right is, of course, a picture on the inside floor of the skull where those foramina are. These foramina throughout the skull, I think, can be divided into two groups, the ones that I would call the anterior cranial foramina and the posterior cranial foramina. We basically have two groups of five, with another one or two thrown in as we go. But let's look first at these anterior cranial foramina. You see the optic foramen, also called the optic canal, the superior orbital fissure, the foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, and foramen spinosum. Those five are labeled over here on the picture. And a couple of things interesting about these, they all sort of fit right in a row. So you can see I drew that little blue line to indicate from the first one to the last one, they run sort of diagonally across the floor of the skull. And they are all in the sphenoid bone. So if you've studied the bones of the skull, hopefully you have already, these five foramina are all in a single bone. So let's look at these a little more closely then. The one that's most anterior is called the optic foramen, also the optic canal. There's a hole leading into a passageway that goes into the orbit, as you might guess from the idea of optic. The opening is right here, and that little dotted line is then the passageway into the orbit. There's one on this side as well. And notice that that passageway is diagonally into the orbit to meet the eye. And having studied the brain, you now have something to connect to here. The optic tracts come out of the brain, they crisscross in what is called the optic chiasm, and then they run out of that chiasm diagonally into the right and left orbit. And you see that here. The optic nerves don't come out of each side of the brain and go straight into the eye on their own side. There are portions of your visible spectrum in both eyes that travel to both hemispheres of the cerebrum. So those optic structures crisscross here, and those holes that you see are perfectly lined up to do that. So the optic nerve travels through this, and it's really the only thing that does. We're looking at the optic nerve from inside the cranium. Let's look at it from the outside now. When I look at it from the anterior view of the orbit, I'm looking deep into the orbit now, and you see the optic foramen. Notice how sort of round or oval it is. That's the optic nerve. The other opening that you see here is the superior orbital fissure. And a fissure is sort of a slash-like opening. Foramina are typically oval or round, but that slash-like opening that you see is what is typically called a fissure. Notice there's one down lower as well. That's the inferior orbital fissure. We won't deal with that much. That inferior orbital fissure opens down into the cheekbone, down into the maxilla. The superior orbital fissure opens directly back into the skull. So if we come back here to the inside of the skull, we can see here where the superior orbital fissure would be. It's just hard to see because it's kind of under this cliff edge. Recall, if you will, that the skull has three cranial fossa within it. There's that anterior cranial fossa that's like the big shelf where the frontal lobe sits. And then you have a very sharp edge there, right at the tip of where those two arrows are. Not the arrows into the optic foramen, but the other two arrows. And then you've got these two deep side pockets where the temporal lobes of the cerebrum fit. And it's right in the front of that area that the superior orbital fissure then opens into the orbit. So it's a little bit under. You can kind of see the one on the right or on the left-hand side in the picture. So superior orbital fissure is there. You have to have a different sort of perspective to see it from behind. The third of the openings that we're looking at is the foramen rotundum. And they're right here, just posterior and a little bit medial to where those superior orbital fissures are. These open into the facial bones, not really to the outside of the skull. The holes posterior to that are the foramen ovale and the foramen spinosum. That ovale is fairly large. It's very oval in its nature. It's not too hard to pick out. We're still in the sphenoid bone. And then the little tiny hole right behind that is the foramen spinosum. There's one on each side, so the ovale and the spinosum are right there in order. If you look at these from the opposite side, you don't see the foramen rotundum here because it goes into the face, but you do see the ovale, easy to find, and the little foramen spinosum too, and you can see those on both sides. So there are 5 openings here, all in the sphenoid bone, that are right in sort of a diagonal line from one to the other. One of the little memory tools that I use for this is to pronounce the funny word os-ros, O-S-R-O-S, os-ros. If you have that in mind for these foramina, you can see the first O is optic, the second letter S is for superior orbital fissure. The R is rotundum, the O is ovale, and the S is spinosum. So I've sort of used the words that are not foramen, and we get O-S-R-O-S or os-ros. So that may help there. Those are all in order. So those are the 5 anterior foramina, all sort of in a row. Now, there are also 5 posterior cranial foramina. These are sort of from the sphenoid bone posteriorly into the temporal bone and back into the occipital bone. And those are indicated in this picture over here on the right. You see the 5 of them there. And I want to start with the internal auditory meatus. From the name, you might guess that this has something to do with hearing. This hole is in the temporal bone, so let's locate the temporal bone first. The little opening is right here, so the temporal bone is right there about where that temporal lobe of the brain would be. There are two portions to the temporal bone. There's what is called a squamous portion of the temporal bone, and that's the flat sidewall of the temporal bone that protects the skull. Maybe you remember the word squamous from early in the class when we studied epithelial cells, and one of the three types of epithelial cells was squamous, and it referred to a cell that was very flat. Well, this flat sidewall takes that same name. Now that's contrasted with this portion right here, which is the petrous portion of the temporal bone. This is a big, chunky piece of bone. It stands up kind of like a mountain range from the center of the skull diagonally out to the side. Petrous has that word that means stone or rock in Latin. So this rock-like piece of bone is here, and within this is the hearing apparatus. So it's no accident that the hole that's coming out of that hearing apparatus toward the brain is here on the inside of the skull by the temporal bone. Let's think about how that hearing situation would work. On the outside of that skull, where we can't see it, is of course the external auditory meatus, the passageway that allows sound to enter the hearing apparatus. So sound comes in from the outside into the hearing apparatus in the temporal bone. The hearing apparatus then changes physical sound waves into neural impulses, and then the nerve carrying those comes out through this internal auditory meatus and into the brain. So we have sound in, a changing of that sound into neural impulses, and then the passage of those sound waves through the vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve 8, from there into the brain. So as you think about this again, it's right, sound coming into the petrous portion, being transduced, and then the internal auditory meatus for the nerve carrying those sound impulses. Now, the next two in this list are the carotid canal, right here, and the jugular foramen. Now, these are both blood vessels. One is an artery, one is a vein, but notice that they are side by side here externally on the skull. Let's take a different view of the skull here and notice the internal carotid and the internal jugular blood vessels coming up through the neck and entering the skull here. Now, although they enter side by side, they take a completely different direction. The internal carotid artery goes toward the front of the skull anteriorly, while the posterior area is where the internal jugular vein comes from. So they hit the skull in almost the same place externally, but they pop up into the skull in two completely different places. Notice that these two are entering right under that petrous portion of the temporal bone. So let's use our understanding what we just talked about in the petrous portion of the temporal bone, and let's see where these two would enter. Now we're looking from the inside here, but let's scope out where that entrance would be. Here's the petrous portion of the temporal bone again, and here's where that jugular foramen is. Now remember, a vein is carrying deoxygenated blood out of the skull. So deoxygenated blood is flowing out from under the temporal bone through this jugular foramen. The carotid artery is actually entering right here, but underneath the temporal bone. Don't think this little circle is on the inside. This is where that entrance is, underneath the temporal bone. What is fascinating, though, is the carotid artery enters, and then it takes a horizontal track through the bone and then pops up way over here. So here's where the carotid artery actually enters the skull, over here near the sella turcica, which is that little socket where the pituitary gland sits. Remember, the pituitary gland is attached to the hypothalamus. You see the two optic foramina just in front of that. The optic chiasm would be right in front of that sella turcica. So the carotid artery is entering the skull, so its location on the inside is different from its location on the outside because of this canal. Here's kind of another way to view that. This doesn't have the jugular part of it in it, but here's the internal carotid artery going into the bone, taking a right turn or a left turn and running horizontally, diagonally through the bone, and then popping up next to the sella turcica. So the path of the internal carotid artery. Let's kind of indicate these here. The internal carotid artery enters, passes horizontally, enters the skull by the sella turcica. Now, here's another opening that we need to make mention of here, because all textbooks include this, but most textbooks include this in an incorrect way. They make things very confusing for the student here, and some students just memorize what they see. I just want to make this easy for you to understand. If you're following that carotid artery as it takes its zigzag approach up into the skull, notice that just as it turns to go up into the skull, right underneath that, there's a little bit of blue cartilage. They use the color blue, and there's a hole there right under where the carotid artery turns to enter the skull. It's closed with cartilage in a living person, and you and me, we do not have a foramen lacerum. But in the skull that students typically study in class, the cartilage has been lost. There's no cartilage in the front of the nose on a skull, cartilage in other places, the ears are gone, and this cartilage is gone. And so there's a hole there. So you can technically see entirely through the skull from inside to outside because the two holes are lined up. The foramen lacerum here is only the inferior opening, only that opening at the bottom of the carotid canal. So what gets confusing here is that if you're looking from the outside, you can see where the foramen lacerum is, but you should not indicate it from the inside. And let me give you an example that may help. If you've studied the sacrum, students in my class have already studied the sacrum. We looked at both the anterior and the posterior side of the sacrum, and we saw that there were holes on both sides. Well, you'd be tempted to say those are the same holes, but they're not. On the posterior side, we call these holes the dorsal foramina, and on the anterior side, we call these the pelvic foramina. Well, they're lined up. They're straight in line with one another. You can see all the way through the sacrum here, but they are separate holes. You can especially see this on the posterior aspect. There's a sacral canal that runs down vertically through the sacrum, and the nerves that are running in that canal then go out through the holes. And there's a branch of the nerve that goes posteriorly through the dorsal foramina and a branch that goes anteriorly through the ventral foramina. So there's an intermediate space, and you wouldn't call the holes on the anterior side the dorsal foramina, and you wouldn't call the holes on the posterior side the pelvic foramina, just because they're lined up. Now, maybe from that example, you can see that the hole here, just because it's lined up with the hole here, they are not the same hole. And the temptation And I think kind of the laziness or the ignorance of many people is to use that inside arrow to point to where the carotid canal is and say it's the foramen lacerum. Well, it's not, any more than a dorsal foramina is a pelvic foramina. I've kind of drawn my own little image here that shows kind of the relationship between the jugular foramen, the carotid canal, and you can see the petrous portion of the temporal bone, the little hearing apparatus. See how this is coming in right underneath. I drew my cartilage yellow in this picture rather than blue, so I didn't want to get confused with the jugular vein over there. But notice then how the foramen lacerum and the internal opening of the carotid canal would be right in line with one another. And so this can become confusing. Looking at this whole thing from the outside, here's where the foramen lacerum would be. See the little cartilages here. Now, if I take those cartilages out, right, that's what the hole looks like from outside. And you can see all the way through it. But only the external opening is what we're going to call the foramen lacerum. So remind yourself where the carotid artery enters the skull from externally, from an external view, and where the jugular vein exits the skull. And those two are right here, side by side externally. If you're inside the skull, they're far apart, with the jugular going toward the posterior and the carotid artery coming up, way up there in front. You can see where I did the red circle. Just look across to the left side, and you can see how you can see all the way through there. So, reviewing here, we want to pick up these other two, but let's write these in. This is the carotid canal. Here's the jugular foramen. Here's where the foramen lacerum would be. Now there's two more openings that are posterior here, the hypoglossal canal. This is really going to help you when we go to study the cranial nerves, because this is named for one of the 12 cranial nerves. This canal runs through the occipital bone horizontally, kind of like the carotid canal does. Notice it's right above the occipital condyles. If you know the occipital bone, you know the two occipital condyles flank the foramen magnum, which is that big hole in the center. You can't miss that one. But the hypoglossal canal is a little bit hard to see because it runs horizontally through the bone. You have to have a unique sort of view to see where that is. So here are the 5 openings from the outside that you'd want to be able to identify on the posterior part of the cranium here. Now, if we go inside, remember we already mentioned that internal auditory meatus. There's 5 on the inside. You can only see foramen lacerum from the outside. You can only see the internal acoustic meatus or auditory meatus from the inside. But here are those others, right? The petrous portion is here, so the carotid canal or the internal carotid foramen is right here, right? The jugular foramen is here under that petrous portion, coming into the back. Here's the opening for the hypoglossal canal running horizontally and diagonally through. And of course, there's the foramen magnum. So I think there's a total of 11 holes here, but 5 in the front and 5 internally and 5 externally here in the back. Now, the last thing I want to do is take you through the significance of this carotid canal, because now that you've seen it and seen that it's kind of odd, what is the big deal? Why doesn't it just come in where it comes in there by the jugular foramen? Why does it come way over here? Well, the 2 internal carotid arteries enter right here next to the sella turcica. There are 2 other arteries that are very important to blood flow in the brain, and they come through the foramen magnum. These are called the vertebral arteries. They come up through the little transverse foramina of the vertebra, the cervical vertebra. They come through the foramen magnum, the anterior side of the brainstem, And they do something that arteries typically don't do. Arteries branch and branch and branch and get smaller and smaller and smaller. Very seldom do they unite like they are doing here. These two vertebral arteries unite and form a single artery called the basilar artery. And that basilar artery is now headed straight for the sella turcica. So it's interesting that all three major arteries that enter the skull, that go to the inside of the skull, all head for the same location. The other thing that makes this more interesting is that these arteries then are joined by a circle of arteries that unite them. And notice that that circle then surrounds the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus of the brain. That's no accident, as you're going to see in a minute. From this circle, then, come three pairs of cerebral arteries, arteries that are going to come out from under the brain and sweep up over the top of the brain. So those cerebral arteries look like this: two anteriorly, two medially, and two posteriorly. So there are anterior, middle, and posterior cerebral arteries. When you study your blood vessels, you'll pick these up. But they're all joined into a ring called the cerebral arterial circle. So this is the layout of those arteries. Here's what they look like when they come out from under and sweep over the cerebral cortex, bringing oxygen to those very, very active cells on the surface of the cerebrum. Now, what does this all mean, though, that before it went over the cerebrum, that it first encircled the hypothalamus? Well, you know, the pituitary gland is connected there. The little white dot in the center there represents right where the pituitary gland would be. And so you can just say that's right where the hypothalamus would be. If we look at a picture of the brain, here's what that looks like, right? You can see the pituitary gland in there in the center. You can see the arteries sweeping around that, the arteries that came up the brain stem. But what is so important about the hypothalamus? Well, as you learned in the autonomic nervous system lecture and in just talking about the brain in general, it's the control center for chemical autonomic functions. So my body chemistry is adjusted and controlled by this part of my brain. Well, how does the hypothalamus then know the chemical state of my body? You can't control something if you don't know what state it's in, right? I can't control the temperature of my room to make it hotter or colder if I don't know what temperature it is first. I have to go, oh, the room is cold, I'm going to warm it up. Oh, the room is warm, I'm going to cool it down. If I didn't know if it was hot or cool, I wouldn't know whether to heat it or cool it. Same thing with your human body. The brain knows the chemical actions of the body through the bloodstream. So the cardiovascular system is the one system that touches every single cell in the human body. Every cell receives from and gives to the chemistry of the blood. The chemistry of the blood is the melting pot. You can take a blood sample and know what's going on chemically throughout the entire human body. And that's just what the hypothalamus is doing. The blood flow goes to the hypothalamus first because it's so important that the hypothalamus gets a rich, rich blood supply. Blood flow is maximized first to the hypothalamus, then spread around and through the rest of the brain. So this is all indicated by the fact that those internal carotid arteries are coming up right there. And the other two major blood supplies is also coming straight to the hypothalamus. So really, really important to see, although the carotid artery enters in one place, it travels over to where it can influence the hypothalamus. So here's that layout of these openings and the significance of the carotid arteries entering here. So many, many foramina in the skull. You see them anteriorly, you see them interiorly, you see them inferiorly. So hopefully this helps you see and study those openings well. Okay, so have a good day.